Hello everybody, welcome to another video. I thought I'd take a break from my CCP history videos, and I thought it'd be funny to go through a lot of the arguments that the Chinese government likes to make about why democracy is terrible and why dictatorship is great. Some of the arguments that I put in this list are made by state media or government officials themselves, and some of them are arguments that you often hear from Wu-Maos online. For anyone who doesn't know what Wu-Maos are, they're Chinese internet commentators who are given a government VPN and either paid or ordered to just go online and spread pro-Chinese government propaganda. And some of the arguments in this list are just things that would come up during conversations with some of my Chinese friends in the mainland. Because you can actually end up having political discussions with people, especially at Chinese universities, where people are a bit more open to talking about this kind of thing. And so I think it's worth going through some of the arguments just to take them apart and see the thinking behind them. Because a lot of these arguments are basically put forth as sometimes just a disinformation tactic, but some of them are genuine, and if you don't know a whole lot about China, it can be quite hard to know how to deal with them. If you do know a little bit, it's not that hard to debunk them. So number one, China is not ready for democracy. This is one that I used to hear a lot when discussing with real Chinese people in person, not so much by the government authorities or the state media. And the obvious thing to mention about this is that the CCP, the Chinese government, has no intention of ever allowing China to become a democracy or allowing its people to vote in a multi-party system. Actually, the thinking for most Chinese people, I'd say, from talking to them, is that, yes, China's relatively still developing and it's uneducated, but at some point when it's achieved a better standard of living, it will develop into something like a Western-style democracy. A lot of people kid themselves into thinking that this is kind of on the agenda. It's worth remembering that the government's official position is that China is currently a socialist market economy that is transitioning towards communism and will eventually be a communist country. Although when this actually will happen or what it will look like is never elaborated upon. I mean, to see why the government has no plans of ever allowing China to be a democracy, you can just look at some of the sentences passed down onto democracy advocates in China. People whose only crime is to advocate for China eventually transitioning towards a democracy. Totally non-violently. And this often leads to a 10-year prison sentence, sometimes life in prison, because they can just charge you with state subversion and make it an unlimited amount of years. So the most high-profile case of this is Liu Xiaobo, who was a democracy advocate from the 1980s onwards, and in 2011 he was sentenced to basically life in prison and died there because he didn't get any treatment for his cancer. We have many, many other examples of similar advocates. Sometimes people who've never even advocated for any kind of government change in China. They've simply advocated for more transparency or greater functioning of different government institutions. You have advocates who were put in prison for example, compiling lists of people who died in accidents. There's a good article here that gives a diagram over time of the amount of dissidents who've been sentenced to prison over time. These are just the public cases that we know about, so there are many, many more than these that aren't recorded. And you also have Wen Jiabao, the former premier of China, his CNN interview in 2009 where he suggested vaguely that China maybe will develop into more of a democratic and open system. That interview was completely censored after he made it. So to me, this doesn't really make the case that China eventually sees being a democracy in its future. In fact, its leaders often give statements to the contrary. But actually, some of the liberals within the party did used to make this case. So like Wen Jiabao, they'd say that once China reaches a certain standard of living and a certain income, then it could possibly develop into a democracy. Even Deng Xiaoping said this. He said that around the year 2040, China might be the point where it would be allowed to have multi-party elections. But these were arguments that tended to be made in the past. So we can actually compare China to other East Asian countries and see how developed they were at the time when they developed into a democracy. Now, don't forget that China is a very large economic power because of its population size, but per person GDP capita is actually very low. It's around $8,800, which puts it lower than Mexico, Brazil, and Russia. So one obvious comparison to make is Japan, who were basically becoming a democracy after the United States military left them in 1951. We don't actually have very good GDP per capita data going back that far, but some estimates put Japan's GDP per capita in 1960 around $7,000 to $8,000, putting it lower than China's current GDP per capita today. We can also look at South Korea, which transitioned to a democracy in 1987. At the time, Korea's GDP was a very small $3,500. less than half of China's, yet they managed a totally successful democratic transition. Also, Taiwan in 1986 allowed an opposition party to be created, and their GDP per capita was $4,000 a year, putting it at less than half of China's today. So all of these countries can do it at half of the average income of China's, but China still isn't ready despite being a lot richer than these countries at the time that they transitioned. So basically, if they're not going to transition to democracy now, I mean, they could have done it if they'd wanted to at any time in the last 30 years. But the reason they haven't is because it's prevented from doing so by the government. Number 2. China already has democracy, and it's a better system than the West's version of democracy. You could tell these arguments are kind of facetious because of how they actually contradict each other. So China apparently isn't ready for democracy, but also kind of just has democracy right now and it's fine. Well, which is it? But this response that China is a democracy now is actually much more common to hear from the government, and this is because it's actually the standard Marxist conception of what democracy is. And you have to remember that China still has a communist government, despite what you hear in the media. They all still have to read Marxist-Leninist doctrine to be in the party. And what Lenin wrote was that a communist government is the most democratic form of government because it represents the workers, it perfectly represents the people. Whereas bourgeois fake democracies only represent the interests of wealthy bourgeois classes. And the communists, of course, represent their people by managing everything so carefully, picking and choosing what's in the best interests of the workers, and controlling what they can and can't buy. So the Chinese government still has this conception of itself, and always uses it as a defense, saying that all Western democracy is a tool to exploit the poor. Now, putting aside the fact that Western democracies have managed to make their own citizens a lot better off than China has, but China also manages to be one of the most unequal countries in the world. It's far more unequal than the United States, for example, which is apparently a completely capitalist country, and China is apparently a communist country. Another thing that you might not be aware of is that in China, members of the party have special privileges. They have special things like VIP waiting rooms, better access to seating arrangements, better access to facilities. Now, can you imagine the outrage or the outcry if people of a political party in a developed country, if politicians there had, let's say, VIP waiting rooms or special access to government facilities? It would be a massive scandal, but in China that's just part of the system, it's considered normal. Now, one thing that's important to point out is that China nominally or seemingly has legislative elections every few years. In reality, these are just for show. First of all, it's very, very difficult to get into these elections to even be on the ballot. And if you win, the people above you, the government officials, can simply dismiss you. In fact, people who reported on this found that over 50% of people who were elected were just dismissed over the next couple of years. And let's say, even if you don't get dismissed and you get elected as someone who genuinely wants to change the system, eventually work your way up and you get onto the National People's Congress, which is allegedly the lawmaking body. Now, in its entire history, according to Caixin, the NPC has never rejected a single law put in front of it by the Standing Committee, which is the top leadership of China. So get that, this is supposed to be the lawmaking body, and it's never once rejected a drafted bill that's been put in front of it to be made law. It's just a rubber stamping body. And so whenever you hear any of this stuff about China having local elections or China having some version of democracy, it is not true at all, don't buy it. Number 3. Democracy would not work in China. This is another very ridiculous argument, because what a lot of people don't know is that China actually had a democracy in 1916. When the KMT partially took over the government, they first held elections, and they set up sort of devolved parliaments, and they achieved a level of democratic representation that countries like India or Japan didn't achieve until the 1960s. Now, the KMT won that election, but then the country was plunged into civil war after their candidate was assassinated by a Qing dynasty general. But if you didn't have assassinations and the threat of civil war, they very quickly set up democratic institutions that worked very well. I'd also point out that Chinese people, wherever they tend to live in the world, they participate in democratic countries very well. Many ethnic Chinese people stand for elections in these countries. You have the obvious example of Taiwan, which is totally a Chinese country. It's full of Chinese people. The only difference is that they're run by a government that aimed for a democratic transition. They aimed to be a democracy. So to be honest, actually, Chinese people are more competent, are more capable than most other parts of the world of turning into a democracy if they want it. Because Chinese people, wherever they live in the world, are actually very successful economically. In fact, the only place where they're not as successful is China itself. This is another one of those arguments that only makes sense if you pretend that Chinese people outside of the mainland don't exist. Okay, let's continue. Number 4. Authoritarianism makes China peaceful and stable. So this is another one of the CCP's favourite lines, claiming that their authoritarian rule makes China a harmonious society. And they started talking about this a lot in the 2000s. And like what most of the CCP says, it's completely wrong. Contrary to popular belief, China has protests all the time. You just don't hear about them because they're covered up by the Chinese media. Here's footage of protests in Jiangxi, Guangdong, Wuhan, Hubei, Hunan. And by 2010, China was experiencing a whopping 180,000 protests a year. Obviously, a lot of these are very small scale, and the reasons for this are quite simple. China's one of the most corrupt countries in the world. In 2018, China was ranked by Transparency International as being worse than countries like India and Benin and Burkina Faso in Africa when it comes to corruption, which is quite an achievement. And so most of these protests are actually caused by things like governors abusing their power, stealing money from citizens, not investigating crimes, or imprisoning people without cause. Often things that make people very angry, and things that don't happen in democratic countries, because there's a system in place to stop it. In addition to the corruption, you have the fact that China is one of the most unequal countries in the world. And this is a source of great tension among ordinary Chinese people. In 2010, there was a city in Guangdong called Wukan, which was completely taken over by protesters because of alleged corruption. They kicked out all of the CCP officials and formed their own government. And then the Chinese government basically laid siege and blockaded the city over the course of a month, which resulted in eventually most of the protesters being put in prison. And you also have the fact that people's homes in China could be demolished by the local government, just in many cases because they want to build infrastructure or they want to build a tourist attraction. This is something that I've actually seen with my own eyes and recorded footage of. Another thing that gets talked about is China's low crime rates. Now, to be fair, China does actually have low crime rates, and it's something that you experience if you go there. Especially in the cities, you'll tend to find that in the cities, crime is very, very low, and it gets a bit higher when you go out to the villages, or when you go out to the countryside, which is the opposite of, most developed countries in the world. There's actually a recent book by a German criminologist called Crime and the Chinese Dream. And in this book, he found that the faking of crime statistics by police in China is rampant. And this happens because police in China only get paid for cases that they solve, or the rate of cases that they solve. And as a result, the police pretty much only ever prosecute cases that they're sure they can solve very easily, which is what leads China to having a 99% conviction rate. And he found that most police stations actually have two files of crime statistics on file. One that they give to the government, which shows all of the solved crimes, and one that actually records the real crimes that they're tracking. And he found that most of this violent crime happens in fourth or third tier cities with recent immigrants who have very little job prospects and often just join gangs. And so it's actually a very sad situation that this happens to so many Chinese people. But like I said, China in general does have low crime rates, but the other East Asian countries, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, also have very low crime rates. So there's nothing to suggest that China's crime rate would be higher without a dictatorship. Number 5. Authoritarianism makes things more efficient. This is another argument that you hear from the government a lot, and annoyingly it's one that gets repeated by the Western media a lot. So you saw it recently when the Chinese government built a hospital in 10 days that was falling apart. And the media were incredibly amazed by this and wrote many articles about how great this was and how it could never happen in a democratic country. And yet when the UK built a hospital in less time, they were completely silent. The Western media still has this idea of China that it's got this novel, interesting system that it can learn from. As I said before, China is one of the most corrupt countries in the world, and this is completely a result of them being a one-party state. Now, that being said, there are many things that China is able to innovate in quite effectively, like they have their own tech sector, they're able to develop cheaper infrastructure. Yet these are all things that China could have done without being a dictatorship. And how do we know that? Because Japan and Korea are also very good at tech development. Not to mention Taiwan. One of the reasons that China builds much cheaper infrastructure is because of the lack of safety regulations. And this is one of the scariest things about living in China, is that when you live there you see videos all the time of buildings collapsing, of escalators or elevators collapsing. You hear about people dying from it pretty much constantly. There hasn't actually been much of a list of all the equipment failures and building collapses that have happened in China. But just recently you had that hotel in Quanzhou that collapsed a few weeks ago. It's because the company illegally built extra floors on top of it. I was actually in Quanzhou a couple of months ago, in that exact same region, although I've never stayed in that hotel. Just before that, you had a multi-story car park that collapsed in Guangdong. And you hear about these things all the time. In fact, there was a dam in the 1970s in China which collapsed, and the death toll was 250,000 people, which the Chinese government covered up for a long time. Because of the way there's no enforcement of any safety regulation, so many people die because of it. And yes, all the things about public transport and high-speed rail, those are one of the very good things about living in China. They're very convenient. But that plunged the country into massive amounts of debt. And so the amount of things that gets wasted by corruption just makes the country incredibly inefficient. Number 6. Authoritarianism makes it easier to plan for the future. This one is along similar lines to the efficiency argument. And the argument's basically like, oh, look, in democracies, you get one party that gets elected and it does some things, and then the other party comes and gets elected and does a lot of other different things, then it undoes all the stuff the last party did. Whereas in China's amazing dictatorship, instead of bothering with all that, they can just focus on what's good for the country and stick to one plan and make sure that gets done. So this is another argument that just kind of falls apart upon closer inspection. Because no government is omniscient, and no government can completely predict and plan for everything that will happen in the future. In fact, the good thing about democracies is that governments will very often see things a certain way, will often create a strategy for what they think is best for the country. And if that strategy works in a democracy, the people vote for that party and it stays in power. And if that doesn't work, people vote for a different party. And this makes them far more responsive to public demand than you can ever have in an authoritarian system. And you had massive changes in policy under China, in fact far more than you did in pretty much any democratic country. So you had the country being pretty much Stalinist under Mao, to then going incredibly free market and pro-economic liberalization under Deng, to then going back to a massive bureaucratic state under Xi in recent years. Authoritarian countries are actually more changeable or more likely to just get the policy wrong than most democratic countries. Number 7. The CCP is governed by collective leadership and is not a dictatorship. So this is something that people in China will sometimes take offense to. If you say that China's a dictatorship, they're like, no, it's governed by collective leadership. The party makes decisions collectively. And at some point in modern Chinese history, you probably could say that the party was governed by collective leadership. Probably in the 1970s or in the 2000s when Hu Jintao was the president. You didn't have that much domination of the party by a single individual. But under Xi, you completely do. Xi is totally the dominant figure. He's the one enacting the policies. He's the one who it's specifically illegal to criticize, and he's the one who's purging many other people in the party who criticize him. Number 8. The CCP has lifted millions of people out of poverty and has seen the fastest economic growth in history. So this is one that Chinese politicians repeat all the time, every time they get a chance, or every time they're interviewed by Western media. Always, CCP lifted millions out of poverty. And it's another favourite thing that the Wu-Maos like to post online. Now, one thing is that it's not really true that it was the fastest economic growth in history. You can find sort of some brief periods where if you look between, let's say, 1992 to 1997, at that time it was the fastest growth, but you can find other points in history like Korea in the 1980s that were growing faster. And especially if you look at the GDP per capita, it's definitely not the fastest growing economy in history. But even if it were true, the CCP did not lift those people out of poverty. The CCP kept them in poverty for half a century. When Mao died, most Chinese families lived on less than $40 a year. And China became richer because the communist policies were removed. I mean, it's called reform and opening up. That's what the whole period of the 70s is called. According to Chinese party doctrine, it's called 改革开放, which means reform and opening up. Well, why did the economy have to be opened up? It's because it was closed. It didn't allow foreign investment or private enterprise. So this whole thing of the Chinese party lifted them out of poverty, it's like saying that Russia lifted Eastern Europe out of poverty by removing the Soviet Union, as if they intended to do that. Like, if it were up to the CCP, Chinese people would still be on their collective farms. Number 9. The CCP created a unified China that is free from foreign threats. As I pointed out in another video, this is just a ridiculous argument, because China was already unified by the KMT in 1945. After Japan surrendered, because of the European powers and America that fought against it, the only invading power in China was the Soviet Union, who trained the CCP to overthrow the government. In fact, China today isn't unified because of that. The reason there's a whole Republic of China in Taiwan and a communist China in the mainland is because of the CCP. Actually, China was a lot less unified after the CCP took over than it was before. Number 10. Human rights don't exist or are open to interpretation. This is the response that they always give if there's any accusation of China doing anything wrong or accused of violating human rights. It'll either be this or the fact that other countries did bad things, and therefore whatever China did is fine. Now, of course, it's true that the definition of human rights is flexible, but the point is that they're moral standards that we try and fulfill. I mean, human rights are the idea that people have fundamental value, and we don't violate them. In fact, we don't do things to people that are immoral that we wouldn't want to be done to ourselves. And we try and apply the same rule to countries as best we can. And of course, the reason that China wants to completely dismiss the idea of human rights is because it is, by some standards, the worst human rights abuser on the planet. In 2018, China executed more people than the rest of the world put together. And it still, by some accounts, holds up to 8 million people in its labour camps. As for the amount of people that the CCP killed in their history, there's no government that even comes close to their death toll. So that's something that's worth bearing in mind whenever this gets brought up. Number 11. Western countries did worse things in their history than China. So the Western powers obviously did commit many crimes during the colonial period, but to be honest, in those times, empire building is what every single country in the world was doing at the time. Europeans just did it more successfully because of their advanced technology. Now, you don't have to agree with the philosophy of colonialism to point out that not everything the European powers did in that time was bad. For example, you have the fact that they invented modern medicine and modern agriculture technology, which made sure that the world population grew at its fastest rate in history. Even just the invention of penicillin and the vaccination programs that the countries enacted to distribute them in the colonies saved millions and millions of lives. Now, this in no way justifies colonialism, but if you're going to point out the bad sides of it, you have to also point out that. We also only live under the current system that we do now, because after World War II, the idea of invading countries and subjugating them became completely taboo. Now, that's a system imposed by the Western powers, and it's a pretty good one. And even if you try and lay the deaths of every war and every famine or atrocity during those times in the colonial period, it still doesn't come close to the number of deaths that happened under the CCP. The war with the biggest death toll of the 19th century is the Taiping Rebellion, which happened in China. So yes, there was a form of colonialization in China based on the unequal treaties, but these weren't based on conquest or subjugation. They were in a way to force China open to trade of Europeans, and to make them more amenable to European systems of law and religion. Now, again, that doesn't justify it, but it is not the same as what the Japanese did to China, which I often find that the Chinese nationalists like to conflate. Number 12. China's rise has been entirely peaceful, and China doesn't invade other countries. In a way, this is my favourite one because it's such a blatant lie, and it's because they can kind of enforce this propaganda in their own country, but it's something which is ridiculous to do outside of China. The head of the army, the head of the military in China literally said that China had never invaded another country. Now here's a map of China during the Tang Dynasty. Now here's a map of China during the Qing Dynasty. Now, do these look like China today to you? No, and they didn't get that territory through economic trade. And actually some of my students that I taught, I even found that they literally believe that China's borders just never changed over time. That after the 3rd century, China was founded and that was it forever. So I'm going to go through a quick list of some of the territories that China has invaded in the last century alone. You had Russia in 1918, Mongolia in 1919, Soviet Union in 1929, Myanmar in 1942, Taiwan in 1949, Tibet in 1950, Korea in 1950, India in 1962, Xinjiang in 1960, South Vietnam in 1974, Vietnam in 1979. And if we're not looking at invasions and we're just looking at conflicts that they've had, you had another conflict with India in the 80s, Vietnam conflict in 1988, Taiwan Straits conflict in the 90s, all the conflicts in the South China Sea that's happened over the last 20 years. You recently had China send troops into Myanmar to combat the insurgency there. You had troops sent into Pakistan to combat the militia groups there, and all of the troops that were sent in Bhutan during the standoff with India in 2017. So the idea that China didn't advance through military conquest is completely wrong, both historically and in modern day. So these are the most common arguments that I often hear from both online and from the government. And I think many of these points are quite interesting, and many of them probably deserve their own video. Some are just blatant lies or disinformation tactics, so I hope they're kind of useful as like a user guide of how to respond to Wu Maos at least. And I hope that some of it was just interesting to listen to. If you disagree with some of my responses or have different ideas about them, just let me know in the comments, and thank you for listening.